Greetings and welcome to the Modeler's Notes portion of our Bomarc DVD. I'm James Duffy. I'm the producer of this DVD package, and for the next few moments we're going to be discussing some of the kits that have been available over the years of this fascinating prototype, as well as discussing some tactics to help you create your own accurate replica of the Bomarc. While the Bomarc is by no means an obscure subject, it certainly isn't a mainstream one either. You can walk into a hobby shop anywhere in America and find on the shelves a large number of ME-109s, F-4 Phantoms, P-51 Mustangs from a variety of manufacturers. The Bomarc, unfortunately, doesn't suffer from that wide range of availability like this. But at the same time, there have been a surprising number of kits of this particular prototype made available over the years. The Bomarc, of course, was a relic of the Cold War. Development began in the late 40s and continued into the 50s, and finally in the early 60s it became an operational weapons system. Those years, not coincidentally, were also the years when the American plastic model hobby and the associated manufacturers were becoming established. Monogram, Revell, and Aurora all offered Bomarc models in varying scales during that period of time. Of those three American Bomarc releases, the one that I find personally most intriguing were the various Monogram releases. Monogram had a 1/128th scale Bomarc, a fairly small kit. It yielded a finished model that was probably about 3 to 4 inches long. It was originally made available as a bagged kit along with a Regulus and Rascal missile. For less than $1, you could go plop down your money at a hobby shop and build 3 neat little Air Force missiles that you could display. Later on, Monogram extended that line and created what was called the Missile Mobile. This was a boxed kit that added an Atlas, Matador, and Snark along to the Bomarc, Regulus, and Rascal, and gave the model builder the opportunity to create a simple Calder-like mobile that could show all those missiles in flight. Keep in mind, back in the 50s and 60s, Monogram and Revell felt it was important to add value to model kits by building some type of play value into them. In this particular case, the ability to create a mobile. Other models of that era would have features such as retractable landing gear, motorized propellers, and bombs that would drop. I remember the B-58 kit of that era had a little button that you could press and the bombs would just drop off and skitter away broken somewhere. Monogram didn't stop with just the Bomarc and the other missiles that we've already mentioned up to this point. That line had a wide range of U.S. missiles within it. Titan, Redstone, Nike Hercules, Corporal were all covered as part of this series, and eventually they gathered all of these varying kits together and brought them together in a single boxing of 36 space missiles. The latest release of that was in the mid-'80s as part of Monogram's Heritage Edition, and if you prowl those hobby shows out there and also spend some time on eBay, you can find that release out there occasionally. It's going to cost a fair amount of money, but if you're a completist or a collector, it's certainly out there available for you. Also in the late 50s, Aurora, the American manufacturer, perhaps best known for their creature models, released a 1/48th scale model of the Bomarc. They had multiple releases of this with differing box art with each release. These are fairly rare kits and also sell for a significant amount of money on eBay. Another release of that era was from the American firm Comet. Comet is a model company that is still in existence today. They are perhaps best known for their balsa and tissue flying aircraft models. They offered a 1/86 scale Bomarc, and that particular model was also made available under the Temco and Cleaware brands. Any of those three pressings are extremely rare. Another very intriguing Bomarc release from that era was from the American firm Topping. Topping was not a traditional hobby model company. They existed to service the aerospace industry itself with high-quality contractors models that could be used to present to military personnel, senators, government staffers, individuals who worked on different aerospace programs. And until Pentagon procurement rules changed in later years, they were a fairly significant and very important company in the aerospace industry. They offered a model of the Bomarc, not a kit. It was pre-assembled, pre-painted, pre-labeled, and came with a very impressive stand that was approximately 1/48 scale. These models occasionally pop up on eBay. I watched a couple go through the sales process just recently, and each sold in what I could only describe as average, slightly beat up condition in the neighborhood of $250 to $300. Topping made a very wide range of models. Practically any American prototype of the 50s and 60s was produced by Topping for that contractor's model market. Many of the film elements on this DVD have Air Force personnel who are holding presentation models of the Bomarc. In all likelihood, those are examples of the Topping contractor's model. Now let's move on to what is by far the most widely available replica of the Bomarc, both then and now, and that is the Revell 1/47th scale kit. It's interesting to note that back in the 50s, manufacturers weren't as concerned as they are today with producing kits in constant scales. For instance, a common large scale for models today is 1/24th or 1/32nd scale. You find very few deviations from those norms in a large model kit. Then it was more critical for the manufacturer to develop consistency in box size. So they would develop a model kit and then size the mold so that the resulting sprues would fit into an existing box. Revell first released their Bomarc kit in 1957 at a suggested list price of $1.49. That may not seem like a lot of money to us today, but when you consider that 1958 sales of that kit totaled 457,000 units, that was over $750,000 in 1950s dollars that were shared by the manufacturer, distributors, and hobby shops. That's a lot of money by any stretch of the imagination. I also find it fascinating that there is no kit today that could hope to come anywhere near that type of unit shipment. Now let's talk about the Revell Bomarc kit itself. When you open that box, the first thing that strikes you are the immense number of pieces, and the second thing that hits you is that most of those pieces are not for the Bomarc missile itself. Most of those pieces assemble into the reasonably well-detailed launch and display stand. If you're a model builder anything like I am, it's difficult to resist that urge to leave well enough alone and build the kit straight from the box. In particular, the launch platform gives the model builder the opportunity to go nuts with super detailing. Your local hobby shop, especially in the model railroad section, should be able to offer a wide range of little doodads that you can add to the launch platform to give it a more realistic look. As a fairly enthusiastic scratch builder myself, I wouldn't dream of not having a copy of the Walthers Railroad parts catalog on hand, both in the NZ scale version and the HO scale version, because there's just a huge number of scratch building and detailing parts available in that catalog. With those part numbers in hand, you can go hit the staff at the local hobby shop and get those in very quickly, and they really give your scratch built and your super detailed projects a great deal of punch. Let's move on to the missile parts themselves. The biggest difference between the Revell kit of the 50s and what a contemporary release of the Bomarc missile might look like today is in the detail, the described detail that's so critical to a realistic model. In the 50s, it was much easier to build a mold with inscribed detail into the mold, tool surface itself, that would yield a raised detail part on the model. That's considered unacceptable by today's standards. Most contemporary model kits have recessed detail lines and panel lines. It's a simple matter to sand the detail that's on the Revell kit off using various grits of sandpaper, again available from your local hobby shop, and then rescribing those details using a good scribing tool. In particular, I use a purpose-built tool from Squadron. I believe it's actually a Pakistani-sourced dental tool that they've modified somewhat. You should be able to find very similar tools at local hobby shows and contests if they don't have them available at your local hobby shop. If you elect to build a Revell 48th scale Bomarc, the most critical thing you'll need to do to make an accurate model kit is to remove the raised decal locations that litter the surface of the kit. In the late 50s, when the 48th scale Revell Bomarc was originally engineered, this was seen as a way to help model builders have a better chance of reliably turning out a more acceptable finished model. Fortunately, American model manufacturers abandoned that practice of putting those raised decal locations on kits soon after that. If you decide to tackle the building of a Revell 48th scale Bomarc, one thing that's going to become apparent very soon is that you're going to want to replace the original kit decals. A couple reasons for that. First off, the quality of the decals is not very good. Second, you're restricted to only one choice, and that is for one of the black and white early test Bomarcs. A better approach for modeling one of the early black and white Bomarcs would be to mask and paint all of the white and black areas. I would approach that by painting the entire model white first, masking off the white areas, and then repainting it over with a black. Frankly, my favorite paint scheme for the Bomarc were the later Canadian operational versions, which were a grayish-white color with very bright red and blue Canadian Air Force markings. There's a manufacturer of aftermarket decals, a gentleman by the name of Tom Prestia. I've had the good fortune to work with him on many projects prior to this, and he has a company called Tango Papa. Tom is a very gifted illustrator and uses his experience with CorelDRAW to create very accurate decals, primarily for the model rocket market, although he does do a great deal of work for the scale model market as well. Tom offers a set of Canadian Air Force Bomarc decals in a variety of scales, and they could certainly be resized and custom produced in 48th scale should you decide to do a Canadian Air Force Bomarc. There's also a company out there called Can Mill Air that produces generic Canadian military decals that could also be used to create a Canadian Air Force Bomarc. Should you choose to do an operational U.S. Air Force Bomarc, there's plenty of options out there. I would raid the decal section of your local hobby shop through those 48 scale aircraft decals, and I'm sure that there's some options out there to help you kind of kludge together an acceptable set of markings for a USAF Bomarc. It may have occurred to you by now that if you're going to go to the trouble of sourcing aftermarket decals or perhaps create your own using a laser printer and super detailing a launch platform, that you're only a hop, skip, and a jump away from actually scratch building the entire model itself. The Bomarc, fortunately, is a great introduction to scratch building. A simple model can be constructed from standard styrene stock. In particular, a 1/2-inch outside diameter styrene tube, again available in the model railroading section of any good hobby shop, could be used as the basis to construct a simple 1/70th scale model of the Bomarc. The wing and tail surfaces could then be constructed from 040 to 060 styrene sheet. You could gently sand the airfoil shapes into that. The most difficult components, if you should elect to scratch build your own Bomarc, would be the nose cone, the tail cone, and the uniquely shaped ramjet nacelles. All of those components could be turned on a lathe. I've done similar components using a Delrin material that I source from a local plastics supplier. That could then be used as the basis to construct a mold that you could produce resin parts from. You could actually go into business perhaps. Again, I really do think that the Bomarc would be a great introduction to scratch building if you've got a little bit of experience in super detailing other projects in the past. If you're interested in a flying model of the Bomarc, well, you're in luck. The American model rocket manufacturer Estes has made a fairly wide selection of Bomarc kits available over the years, although unfortunately none of these are currently in production. The first was a gliding model of the Bomarc that was produced as a boxed kit, part of their Citation line, from 1972 until 1977. In 1978, Estes fairly significantly altered this kit, changing it from a boost glide recovered kit into a standard parachute recovery kit. Estes also produced a smaller version, probably around 1/48 scale, from 1972 until 1980. This particular version was designed to fly on the smaller 13mm mini motors, and it's interesting to note that this was also offered with the Royal Canadian Air Force markings. Despite the fact that all of the Estes Bomarc kits have been out of production for almost a quarter century now, it should be a fairly simple matter to clone or scratch build one of these models. The custom balsa parts you'll need to do this are available from a firm called Balsa Machining Service, and Tom Prestia at Tango Papa Decals can certainly produce the decals for any of these kits. There is one other Bomarc model produced by Estes that's worth mentioning. In the mid-90s, Estes purchased an existing company called North Coast Rocketry. During that period of time, Estes saw an opportunity to begin serving the emerging mid-power rocketry community that was developing. They were losing significant market share to a company called Aerotech, and decided that a good way to approach the market and to get into that market would be to purchase an existing company. They identified North Coast Rocketry as a likely candidate for that and made a deal to acquire that firm. At the time of the acquisition, NCR offered a 1/10 scale model of the Bomarc that was constructed entirely of traditional rocket materials, plywood, paper, and a plastic nose cone. Estes modified that basic design, exchanging the plywood wing and empennage for vacuform parts that were placed over a balsa framework. Unfortunately, Estes offered the North Coast Rocketry line for only a couple of years in the 99-2000 time frame. Occasionally, those kits pop up on eBay and have recently sold for upwards of $200. Interestingly, most of the NCR Bomarcs that I've actually seen built and fly have had the vacuform parts replaced by plywood components, much like the original design of that model. Well, that brings us to the end of the Modeler's Notes portion of our Bomarc DVD. There's a few commercial firms that we've mentioned here today that we encourage you to visit on the web. In particular, Tango Papa Decals, Can Mill Air Decals, and Balsa Machining Service. We'll put links for all three of those firms on the links page of our website at www.rocket.aero.